Howdy again everyone, and let's get straight into reviewing the living daylights out of this solid little block of optics, the Sigma 24-70mm f2.8 DG OS HSM. It's an image stabilized, fast standard zoom lens for full frame digital SLR cameras, although it can also be mounted onto mirrorless cameras. It works particularly well on Sony cameras when used with Sigma's dedicated MC11 adapter, and also works perfectly when adapted onto a Canon EOS R. It costs just over $1,000 or a little over £1,000 here in the UK, so it's a little expensive, but still more affordable than Canon's equivalent L lens, which doesn't even have image stabilization, so it's a comparatively good deal, at least. I'd like to thank Sigma UK for loaning me a copy of this lens for a few weeks for testing, although as usual, this is a totally independent review. It almost feels like a blast from the past for me to be testing out a zoom lens for digital SLRs nowadays, but this is a particularly important one, and at barely 3 years old, it's not an old one. It offers a typical zoom range for a lens in its class. 24mm is a very wide angle, zooming into short telephoto at 70mm. And the relatively bright maximum aperture of f2.8, while not competing with a prime lens, still gives you nicely autofocus backgrounds and quicker shutter speeds for shooting in darker situations. Also, image stabilization gives you a real advantage in keeping your pictures sharp at slower shutter speeds and at keeping your video footage steady. Here's some footage with stabilization turned off and now turned on. It makes a dramatic difference, as you can see, holding your image steady with just a hint of jerkiness to it. Mind you, I was shooting this footage on quite a blustery day. By the way, for anyone who doesn't know this, you should never take the lens off your camera while the image stabilization system is at work. It could damage your lens. If you're shooting on an APS-C camera rather than full frame, the zoom range will be the full frame equivalent of 36 to 105mm or so. 36mm isn't a very wide angle particularly, so a 17 to 50mm f2.8 lens, specially designed for APS-C cameras, will be much more suitable for APS-C shooters, not to mention much smaller and cheaper. I'll just be testing this full frame lens on a full frame body today. The lens's design is somewhat short and stubby looking, with an 82mm filter thread at the end. It weighs just over a kilogram, so it's not light either, although it does feel very solid and well made. Its build quality is lovely really. It's based on a metal lens mount edged with a good sized weather sealing gasket. The zoom and the focus rings are both rubberized and turn extremely smoothly. The focus ring can be turned quite precisely and at any time, as you'd expect with a lens at this price. The lens does exhibit quite some focus breathing, zooming out as you focus more closely. That will be annoying to video makers, but I've found it to be quite a common characteristic of fast standard zoom lenses. The lens's autofocus motor runs with a huge turn of speed there, zipping back and forth across the focus range with almost lightning speed. It emits a slight whooshing sound as it does so, which will be slightly picked up by your camera's microphone if you're shooting video. It worked nice and accurately for me when mounted on my Canon EOS R and Sony a7R II cameras. The zoom ring is particularly nice to handle on this lens, turning somewhat heavily but very smoothly with no stickiness at all, so video makers might be particularly interested in that. The lens comes with a nicely designed hood with rubber edging and one of Sigma's very handy carry cases. All in all, its build quality is pretty much beyond reproach here. It handles beautifully like most other modern Sigma lenses. So let's move on and look at image quality. Using Sigma's official adapter, I've mounted the lens onto a Sony a7R II here with its 42 megapixel full frame sensor. Inner camera corrections are turned on. At 24mm straight from f2.8, the lens is very sharp in the middle with good contrast. The image corners are soft. Stop down to f4 to see a good improvement there though, and f5.6 looks nice and sharp now. The corners stay this sharp down to f11, although stop down to f16 and some softness from diffraction will start to creep in, and at f22 that unavoidable effect which affects every camera lens just becomes stronger. Let's zoom in a bit now to 40mm. It's good news here. The middle of the image continues to look very sharp straight from f2.8, and the image corners are better than before, still looking reasonably sharp even at the brightest aperture. Stop down to f4 and, predictably, the corners get even sharper, and at f5.6 they're almost perfect. Again, they stay this sharp down to f11, so that's a great performance in the middle of the zoom range there. Let's zoom all the way into 70mm now. At f2.8, the middle of the image continues to look excellent. Those recidivist corners, though, have relapsed into softness. They struggle to get sharper as you stop down the aperture. Here's f5.6 and even f11 still looks a bit soft. So, overall, it's a little bit of a mixed bag for the lens's sharpness. It's worth bearing in mind here that we are testing on a very demanding 42 megapixel sensor, and that standard zoom lenses are inherently difficult to design. The good news is that the image quality is always sharp and punchy in the middle of the image, and the lens is sharp across the whole image frame in the middle of the zoom range. Its corners are, obviously, soft at the extreme wide angle and telephoto ends though, although at 24mm the corners do sharpen up very well on stopping the lens down, which is a real saving grace, particularly for landscape photographers. Okay, let's move on and look at distortion and vignetting now on a full frame camera. We see a very typical performance for this kind of lens here. Fairly strong barrel distortion at the widest angle with some heavy vignetting at f2.8, which is mostly cleared up at f5.6. At 32mm, distortion has straightened out, flipping into moderate pincushion distortion at 70mm with mild vignetting at f2.8, which again clears up at f5.6. Saying all of that just gave me the strangest feeling of presenting the weather somehow. Anyway, a completely average performance here. Let's see about close-up image quality now. The lens is advertised as focusing down to 37cm to your subject, although with some manual focusing I seem to get a little closer than that for some nice shots of smaller subjects. At f2.8, contrast at very close focus distances gets very low. However, you only have to stop down to f4 to see it nicely restored, and at f5.6 we see just a little extra sharpness too. Now let's see how the lens works against bright lights. It's a fairly good performance here, with only light touches of flaring being visible. As you zoom in, contrast holds up fairly well, so it's a good show all round. Now let's take a look at this lens's bokeh. Those autofocus backgrounds always look pretty soft and pleasing to me, which is pretty standard on a Sigma lens to be honest. Blurry areas have only a slight edge to them. That's pretty much all you can realistically ask for in a zoom lens. And related to bokeh is longitudinal chromatic aberration. At f2.8, as you can see, the close-up image quality is still quite soft, but there's actually not too much in the way of colour fringing on bokeh highlights. Stop down to f4 and what little there was is gone, so that's a pleasing result. Overall then, this lens has great build quality, and optically it offers you quite strong, attractive images too, but it's not without its flaws of course, the most obvious of which are those softer image corners at the wide angle and telephoto ends of the zoom range. Thankfully, for landscape photographers, the corners sharpen up if you stop down the aperture, but that particular issue keeps it from competing with the very best fast standard zoom lenses out there for mirrorless cameras. Its close-up image quality could be a touch sharper, and its vignetting and distortion are only average here, but still, it offers you pretty sharp pictures with good colours and contrast, and lovely smooth bokeh, and that will be more than enough for many photographers. It's pretty enjoyable to use. If you want a full-frame, image-stabilized, fast standard zoom lens for a digital SLR camera for a relatively affordable price, then really it's between this and Tamron's G2 version competitor. They are both very similar in build and image quality, even down to sharing the same price on the market. Their optical performances are hard to distinguish. From my tests, I found the Tamron lens to have slightly sharper corners at 24mm, but the Sigma lens is notably sharper overall when zoomed into 70mm with better contrast, so it's swings and roundabouts there. They have equally good image stabilization, vignetting and distortion as far as I can see, nice bokeh, the same levels of focus breathing even. Honestly, you could toss a coin to choose between these two lenses, and I'll leave you to do that, and simply say that the Sigma 24-70mm f2.8 DG OS HSM comes recommended.